Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Today, we're uncovering a story that's been buried for decades, hidden deep within the dusty archives of small Appalachian counties. A tale history itself seemed to erase. This is the story of the Pike family and the dark rituals they performed in the shadowy forests of West Virginia. The year was 1918. While World War I raged across Europe, life in the remote Appalachian mountains followed a slower rhythm. Communities were isolated by thick forests, steep valleys, and dirt roads that vanished each winter. In this secluded region between Pocahontas and Greenbrier counties lived families who rarely ventured into towns. They clung to ancient customs, some brought from Europe, others rooted in the soil of Appalachia itself. The Pike family was known to locals, not admired, but known. Their sprawling estate was surrounded by dense pine and oak woods that swallowed daylight even at noon. The main house stood atop a hill, its dark timber walls absorbing the light. Scattered around were smaller cabins and barns, mysterious structures whose purposes outsiders could only guess. Visitors were rare. When the Pikes needed supplies, an older family member would travel down to Marlinton to trade goods or buy necessities. Still, something about them felt wrong. Maybe it was their refusal to meet your gaze. Maybe it was the eerie silence that seemed to follow them. Or maybe it was the whispers. The quiet gossip passed in warehouses, churches, and among farmers. Tales of strange lights flickering over the Pike property on moonless nights, of voices chanting in the forest that didn't sound human, of laborers who went to work for the family and never returned. To understand the fear surrounding them, we must look at the era. The year 1918 brought the devastation of the Spanish flu, which claimed millions of lives. In the mountains of West Virginia, fear of illness mixed with old superstitions. Families still relied on folk remedies, herbs, prayers, and rituals handed down through generations. Many of these practices came from the traditions of German, Scottish, and Irish settlers. Others seemed even older, possibly shaped by indigenous beliefs absorbed over centuries. The Pikes claimed to possess healing knowledge. They said they could drive away sickness, protect crops, and keep animals alive through brutal winters. People turned to them when doctors failed, and sometimes it seemed to work. Fevers that resisted medicine suddenly broke. Infected wounds healed without explanation, but their help always came with a price. It wasn't always money. Sometimes it was a favor, a secret, or a night spent on their land taking part in what they called a healing ritual. The first official mention of the Pikes appeared in the Pocahontas Times in March 1918. A short notice stated that the county sheriff had investigated strange activity on a rural property. Though the Pike name wasn't used, the description fit their estate. Locals had reported eerie noises from the woods for several nights, chanting in no known language. Sheriff Thomas Aldridge visited, spoke with the family's patriarch, and concluded nothing illegal was happening. Just private religious practices on private land. But the matter didn't end there. Weeks later, reports became darker. A hired laborer named William Cord, an itinerant worker from Tennessee, vanished. He had been helping the Pikes with spring planting. After he failed to return to his boarding house in Marlinton, the owner contacted the sheriff. Cord had said he'd be back within days. He never appeared again. When Sheriff Aldridge questioned the Pikes, they claimed Cord worked for 2 days before leaving for another job. No signs of violence, no witnesses, no body. Just another disappearance in the backwoods. The case was closed as a missing person. Yet locals began to see a pattern. Others had gone missing after visiting the Pikes. A salesman, a sick woman, a handyman repairing a roof. All last seen heading toward that shadowed hilltop estate. For months, whatever was happening there remained hidden. The family kept outsiders away, their gate firmly shut. Then, in May 1918, everything changed. A woman named Sarah Brennan arrived at the Marlinton police station on a stormy morning, desperate to see the sheriff. Mud covered her dress. Her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. Sarah, a midwife and healer well known in the area, served poor mountain families when doctors were too far or too costly. Her story horrified the sheriff. 3 weeks earlier, she had been called to the Pike property to help deliver a baby. One of the women there was struggling in labor, and Sarah agreed to go, as she always did when summoned. She was led to a cabin behind the main house, a dim room lit only by candles and oil lamps. The windows were sealed with thick cloth, blocking every trace of daylight. The birth went as well as could be expected, given the circumstances. What unsettled Sarah most wasn't the birth itself. It was what she witnessed and heard during the 3 days she spent on the Pike property. She described eerie nighttime rituals held in a forest clearing near the main house. According to her, chants echoed through the woods in a language she couldn't identify, accompanied by the sound of crude instruments. Towering bonfires illuminated the trees, casting flickering, distorted shadows across the clearing. Some family members carried strange talismans crafted from animal bones, carved wood, and faded cloth that looked ancient. Sarah also recalled seeing symbols painted and carved onto doors and walls, neither crosses nor anything familiar from her own faith. The markings were intricate, circular in some cases, geometric in others, so complex that she said her eyes ached if she stared too long. When she asked about their purpose, she was told they were for protection. Protection from what, however, was never explained. Sheriff Aldridge recorded Sarah's testimony but took no immediate action. In rural West Virginia at the time, law enforcement resources were scarce and reserved for clear crimes or urgent matters. Without victims' evidence or public demand, strange reports often went uninvestigated. There was also the question of religious freedom. Interfering with a family's private spiritual customs, however unorthodox, was something most officers avoided. Yet Sarah wasn't alone. Within weeks, others began sharing their own troubling encounters. A farmer named Jacob Whitmore told how he once delivered cattle to the Pikes and noticed peculiar stone formations near a barn. Concentric circles with dark, scorched patches at their centers, as though fires had burned there again and again. When he asked about them, he was brushed off and warned not to return. A local merchant, Elizabeth Morton, also spoke up. She remembered a visit from a Pike woman named Ruth, who came into her shop to buy large quantities of coarse salt, dried herbs, and hemp rope. Trying to make small talk, Elizabeth asked if Ruth was preparing winter preserves. Ruth smiled strangely and replied that the supplies were for something far more important. Something that took place once every 7 years to ensure the family's prosperity and protection for the years ahead. It's crucial to remember that 1918 was a time of upheaval. The Great War was ending, leaving millions dead, and the Spanish flu was sweeping across the globe, killing even more. In the remote Appalachian hills, news trickled in slowly, often twisted by rumor and fear. People sought explanations, reaching back to old traditions for comfort or control. Practices long forgotten began to re-emerge. The Pikes claimed descent from an old European bloodline, one that had arrived in America over a century and a half earlier. They said their ancestors carried sacred wisdom, secret rites meant to preserve the balance between the living world and unseen forces governing health, fertility, and death. This knowledge, they insisted, was never meant for outsiders and had been guarded by the family for generations. But there was another version of their story, one whispered by old mountain families. In this version, the Pikes weren't simply folk healers. They were bound by pacts, agreements made with entities that demanded sacrifices in return for wealth and protection. And those offerings, the stories said, weren't limited to crops or animals. They involved something far more valuable, something that might explain why people kept disappearing. Concerned by the growing fear in town, Reverend Samuel Hutchkins of the Marlinton Baptist Church decided to act. In June 1918, he gathered a small group of parishioners and set out for the Pike estate, armed with Bibles and conviction, hoping to lead the family back to the Christian faith. But what occurred that day was never clearly told. The Reverend returned pale, trembling, and silent. When asked what he had witnessed, he said only that he had faced something beyond his understanding, something that tested his very belief. He never mentioned the Pikes again, and 3 months later he requested transfer to another parish far from those mountains. That summer brought suffocating heat to the Appalachians. The air grew thick and damp, clinging to the skin. Around the Pike property, the forest became overgrown and nearly impassable, hiding the estate from curious eyes. Then came new and more disturbing accounts, this time from miles away. Marcus Sullivan, a skilled hunter well known in the area, claimed that one early July morning he saw something strange while scouting for deer. From his perch overlooking a misty valley, he noticed movement among the trees. 7 figures dressed in dark clothing, walking single file along a path he'd never seen before. They made no sound. Carrying wrapped bundles in their arms, he watched them disappear into the woods at the edge of Pike land and waited for their return. They never reappeared. When Marcus tried to find the trail later, it was gone, as if the forest had sealed itself shut. Not long after, the Henderson family, who lived several miles away, reported bizarre behavior from their dogs. Normally calm, the animals began howling through the night, always facing the direction of the Pike estate. When chained closer to the house, they became frantic, injuring themselves in panic. Then one morning, all 4 dogs vanished. They were never found, dead or alive. By mid-July, the Pocahontas Times, which had previously avoided sensational coverage, published a detailed report on the mounting fears surrounding the Pike family and the strange occurrences haunting the quiet mountain community. The headline read simply, "Mysteries in the Mountains Worry Locals." The article avoided naming the Pike family directly, but described a wave of strange events, vanishings, eerie noises from the woods, reports of lights that didn't resemble lanterns or campfires, and an overall sense of dread spreading through the rural communities. The challenge for authorities was the absence of solid proof. No bodies, no witnesses to any crime, no physical evidence or confessions that could justify a full investigation. Sheriff Aldridge stood trapped between an anxious public demanding answers and the law that protected citizens from unwarranted intrusion. Without clear cause, his hands were tied. Then a new figure entered the story, one who would change its course entirely. His name was Jonathan Whitfield, a private investigator from Pennsylvania hired by Margaret Cord, the sister of William Cord, the missing laborer who had vanished months earlier. Margaret had scraped together enough savings to pay for his help. Determined to uncover her brother's fate, Whitfield was well known for solving difficult disappearances in remote regions. He was tall, lean, and sharp-eyed, a man who noticed everything and missed nothing. Skeptical of ghost stories and old folklore, he believed in evidence, logic, and patterns, yet even he could not have anticipated what awaited him in those mountains. Upon arriving in Marlinton in August 1918, Whitfield began by interviewing anyone connected to the Pike family. He spoke with townsfolk, merchants, Sheriff Aldridge, Sarah Brennan, Hunter Marcus Sullivan, and countless others. He filled notebook after notebook with detailed observations, recording not only their words but their tone, gestures, and moments of hesitation when certain subjects arose. What struck him most was the consistency of their testimonies. People who had never met described identical experiences: mysterious lights from the Pike property, rhythmic chanting in the woods, and an overwhelming sense of unease whenever they approached the estate. Whatever was happening there, it wasn't mere superstition. Something real lingered behind the fear. Digging deeper, Whitfield examined the Pike family's past. He discovered that their ancestors had come to the region around 1760 from a rural corner of Germany known for obscure folk practices. The family had settled precisely where they still lived, on rocky, isolated land far less fertile than the valleys nearby. Whitfield began to suspect the location itself held significance, that perhaps the terrain, the arrangement of ridges, stones, and valleys, was tied to their rituals. In the Greenbrier County archives, Whitfield uncovered documents referencing the Pikes as far back as 1832, when a traveling judge disappeared while visiting remote farms. The judge's last known stop had been near the Pike property. The investigation went nowhere, but one investigator had scrawled a chilling note in the margin: "This family keeps ancient secrets. Proceed with utmost caution." Whitfield realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one that stretched across generations. The Pikes weren't merely eccentric. They were participants in a long-standing tradition, one passed down like an inheritance, protected and repeated over centuries. He decided that interviews and archives were no longer enough. If he wanted the truth, he had to see the Pike property for himself. So, in mid-August, Whitfield began exploring the surrounding forest. Staying just out of sight, he used binoculars, a compass, and hand-drawn maps to document every path, building, and movement. He spent long days concealed among the trees, noting the times family members emerged, where they went, and what they carried. Then came his breakthrough. Roughly 2 miles from the main house, in an area almost impossible to reach, he discovered a clearing that was clearly man-made. The surrounding forest had been cut back long ago, but the center of the clearing was barren, its soil black and lifeless, a stark contrast to the green canopy beyond. In the middle stood a perfect circle of large stones, each about 3 feet tall, arranged with mathematical precision. Whitfield hid behind a moss-covered fallen log and waited. His instincts told him this place mattered, and as dusk deepened, he was proven right. Around 9:00 p.m., faint voices drifted through the trees. One by one, 9 figures emerged from the darkness, each carrying a torch. Their faces flickered orange in the firelight. Whitfield recognized several of them from descriptions: the grey, bearded patriarch, 2 older women, and a handful of younger relatives. They took positions around the stone circle. An elder began to chant in a language Whitfield didn't recognize. It wasn't English nor German, nor anything European he knew. The melody rose and fell in hypnotic waves, and soon the others joined in, weaving a strange, haunting harmony that pulsed through the woods. Whitfield watched intently as they began placing objects within the circle: bundles of dried herbs, small cloth pouches that seemed to hold seeds or grains, containers filled with dark liquid. Then came something that made his stomach twist bones. Not small ones from animals, but larger shapes, too large. In the shifting firelight, he couldn't tell for sure what they were, but he feared he already knew. The ritual continued for over 2 hours. Throughout that time, the family maintained their chanting almost without pause, changing only its rhythm and intensity. At intervals, everyone would fall completely silent, as if listening to something unseen and unheard by Whitfield. Then, without warning, the chant would surge again, rising to a near-deafening pitch, a collective cry that sent flocks of birds bursting from the trees above. When the ceremony finally ended, the family remained standing around the circle for several long, tense minutes, unmoving and silent. Then, one by one, they began to drift away, disappearing down the dark paths toward the main house. Whitfield waited nearly half an hour before daring to move. Once sure he was alone, he crept toward the clearing. A foul stench hung in the air, thick and nauseating. A blend of burning herbs, a metallic tang that could only be blood, and something else entirely that he couldn't name. Switching on his small flashlight, he examined the remains within the stone circle. Most of what had been there was reduced to glowing embers and ash, but a few fragments had survived the fire. Among them were bones. Some clearly belonged to animals, deer, perhaps pigs, but others gave him pause. Whitfield had seen human remains before during his investigations. He recognized the shapes, the angles, the structure, and what lay among the ashes looked disturbingly human. Carefully, he wrapped several fragments in cloth and placed them in his pack. These could be the proof that finally triggered an official inquiry. But Whitfield made one critical mistake that night. He lingered too long. Focused on collecting evidence, he forgot to keep watch. He didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. A cold pressure pressed against his back, followed by a calm but stern voice saying, "You shouldn't be here." He turned slowly, keeping his hands raised and visible. 2 men stood before him, both members of the Pike family, one older, with a weathered face and steady grip on a pitchfork, the other younger, likely in his 20s, holding a heavy tool that could easily serve as a weapon. Their expressions were a mix of anger and, strangely, something close to pity. The older man spoke first. "You're the city investigator. We know what brought you here. We know what you're after. But you don't understand us, what we do or why." Whitfield kept his composure, using the calm tone he'd learned from years of diffusing volatile situations. He explained that he was looking for William Cord, a missing man who had once worked for their family. He said he meant no harm, only that he wanted the truth. The younger man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Truth. Everyone wants it, but no one's ready to face it. There are powers in this world greater than your laws, greater than your churches, greater than the cities you come from. We keep the balance. We do what must be done." Whitfield realized he was in a perilous position, alone deep in their territory, with no one aware of his location. But something in their tone caught his attention. They didn't sound like men trying to hide a crime. They spoke like followers defending a sacred duty. That insight gave him an idea. Rather than resist or flee, Whitfield took a risk. He asked to meet their leader, the patriarch of the family. He said he wanted to understand, to hear their side before passing judgment. The 2 men exchanged a long, silent glance. The forest around them was still except for the whisper of the wind and a distant animal's cry. Finally, the older man nodded. "You can speak with him," he said, "but only once. After that you'll leave and never come back. If you keep your word, you'll walk away unharmed. If not, there will be consequences." Whitfield agreed. They walked for nearly 40 minutes through narrow, twisting trails beneath the faint crescent moon. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with an unspoken tension. When the trees thinned, the Pike house came into view, larger and darker than Whitfield had imagined. Built entirely of aged timber, its walls had blackened over time. The house rose 3 stories tall, expanded in uneven sections over the years. Most windows were shuttered or veiled with thick curtains that allowed no light to escape. As they approached, Whitfield noticed the strange markings Sarah Brennan had described. Symbols carved into beams, painted above doors, and hanging from small wooden plaques in the corners. The front door creaked as it opened. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something ancient, almost earthen. The narrow hallway led to a spacious room lit by dozens of candles flickering on shelves and tables. At the center sat the patriarch. He was larger than Whitfield had expected, broad-shouldered, with rough hands hardened by decades of labor. But it was his eyes that held Whitfield's attention, cold gray, piercing, as if they could see straight through him. The man gestured for Whitfield to sit opposite him in a plain wooden chair. Then, in a deep, deliberate voice, the patriarch spoke. "My name is Ezekiel Pike. My family has lived in these mountains for more than a century and a half. We come from old lands, lands where people still remembered how the world truly works. Not the world of your cities or machines, but the real world. The world of cycles and seasons, of giving and taking, of balance." Whitfield listened in silence as Ezekiel began to describe the creed that guided his family, a belief passed down from their ancestors, who carried with them knowledge older than Christianity itself. Knowledge of how to preserve harmony between humanity and the forces that dwell beyond it. The property. Rain pounded the roofs as they hurried from one structure to the next. Cabins, barns, sheds, each standing eerily silent and empty. The smell of wet wood and decay filled the air. Every building looked as though it had been abandoned in a single day. Tools still hung neatly on hooks, plates still sat on tables, beds still made. But there were no people. Not a trace of life remained. When they reached the largest of the outer cabins, Whitfield felt a chill creep up his spine. The door was partially open, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was colder than outside, unnaturally so, and the smell was different, metallic and sour. Their flashlights swept across the room and revealed what looked like ritual objects: clay bowls, burned candles, animal bones arranged in deliberate geometric shapes. And at the center of the floor, a circle carved deep into the wood. The circle was filled with dark stains that everyone immediately recognized as blood. Sheriff Aldridge knelt down, touching the edge of the carving with his gloved hand. "This isn't old," he said grimly. "This was done recently." Whitfield's flashlight caught something in the corner. A woman's shoe caked in mud. He recognized it instantly from Margaret's arrival in town. Nearby lay a torn scrap of fabric, the same color as the coat she had been wearing when she disappeared. "Dear God," one of the deputies muttered. The men searched the rest of the cabin, calling her name despite knowing it was futile. There was no body, no movement, only the echo of their voices and the unrelenting roar of the storm. As they stepped outside, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the forest around them. For a split second, Whitfield thought he saw figures among the trees, motionless silhouettes watching from the darkness. When the thunder crashed and the light vanished, so did the shapes. The sheriff barked orders to split up, half of the group to search the forest line, the others to continue checking the outbuildings. Whitfield stayed near the main house, convinced whatever answers existed would be found there. He returned to the room with the strange markings and began examining them more closely. The patterns seemed to spiral inward toward the fireplace, like a vortex. On closer inspection, Whitfield noticed something behind the soot, blackened hearthstone, a faint draft. He called for one of the deputies, and together they pried loose the heavy stone at the base of the fireplace. Behind it was a narrow passageway descending into the earth. The smell that drifted out was unbearable. They descended carefully with lanterns, following a steep dirt tunnel that twisted downward beneath the house. The deeper they went, the colder it became until their breath was visible in the light. Then, The tunnel opened into a chamber. Whitfield's lantern flickered across a horrific sight, a subterranean room lined with old wooden beams and covered in the same dark symbols as above. In the center lay a stone altar, crude, ancient-looking, slick with something dark that glistened under the flame. Bones were scattered around it, animal and human mingled together, and on the far wall, half buried in the dirt, was a name scrawled in charcoal, M. Cord. James Cooper fell to his knees, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. Sheriff Aldridge said nothing, only turned his face away and ordered the men to get out, now. As they climbed back to the surface, the storm began to subside, leaving only a dull drizzle. When they emerged from the main house, dawn was breaking. Mist rolled through the trees, thick and pale. From the hilltop, Whitfield turned to look back one last time. The Pike estate stood in silence, the house dark against the morning fog. Later that day, when they returned with reinforcements, they found the property exactly as they had left it, except for one detail. Every symbol, every mark on the walls, every carved line in the floor had vanished. The wood was clean, untouched, as though nothing had ever been drawn there at all. Margaret Cord was never found. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead, and the Pike family was recorded as having vacated the property without notice. But no trace of them was ever discovered, not in the neighboring towns, not in church registries, not even in state census records after 1918. It was as if they had been erased. Years later, when Whitfield retired, he refused to speak of the case again. But one thing he did say to a journalist decades afterwards still haunts local folklore to this day. "We thought we were searching for a missing woman," he said. "But I think she was searching for something too. Something the Pikes had been guarding. And maybe they took her because she found it." The handwriting old-fashioned but still legible. The early entries read like a pioneer's journal, accounts of harsh winters, failed crops, births and deaths. But as Whitfield turned the pages, the tone began to shift. By the mid-1800s, the writings had taken on a different nature, descriptions of rituals, offerings, and strange agreements made to preserve the family's land and health. Names began appearing, names that matched people from local missing person reports spanning decades. Some entries even described ceremonies held for renewal, or to appease the ones beneath. The more Whitfield read, the colder he felt. These weren't random ramblings or superstition. They were detailed records, methodical and deliberate, documenting an unbroken lineage of practice and sacrifice stretching back more than a century. One entry, dated October 3, 1832, caught his attention. It referred to a visitor of the law who had been claimed to restore the balance. Whitfield instantly recalled the old record he'd found in the archives, the missing traveling judge. The diary confirmed what had only been suspected then: he had been one of their victims. While Whitfield and the prosecutors examined the half-burned documents, the other officers continued to search the area. They found traces of wagon tracks leading away from the property, heading north toward the dense part of the mountains. The tracks were fresh, likely made within the past 24 hours. It seemed the Pike family had left in haste, possibly during the storm. The officers debated whether to follow immediately, but Sheriff Aldridge decided against it. The terrain was too dangerous, and they had already lost one person. Instead, he ordered the perimeter sealed and guards posted to prevent anyone from tampering with the scene. Throughout the day, townsfolk gathered along the road leading to the estate, whispering among themselves. Some prayed, others wept. The idea that their quiet valley had hidden something so monstrous for so long was almost impossible to accept. Yet the evidence, the bones, the diaries, the symbols, left no room for doubt. By late afternoon, the state authorities had taken control. Reporters from neighboring counties began arriving, but Sheriff Aldridge refused to release details. The official statement was brief. An investigation is ongoing into matters concerning the Pike family of Greenbrier County. Further information will be provided once confirmed. Whitfield, however, couldn't rest. That night, he sat alone in his rented room, reading through one of the least damaged journals. The most recent entries, dated just weeks before the family's disappearance, seemed to have been written by Ezekiel Pike himself. The balance is shifting. The signs are wrong. They come sooner now. We are not enough anymore. Another must be taken before the turning, or all will be lost. The voice in the roots demands renewal. Beneath those words, Smeared as if written in haste was a single name, Margaret. Whitfield's hand trembled as he closed the book. He realized then that Margaret Cord hadn't been a random victim of timing or vengeance. She had been chosen. The next morning, the search teams ventured deeper into the forest following the wagon tracks. They led through dense woods, over narrow ridges, and eventually disappeared into a ravine about 5 miles from the Pike property. No camp, no remains, no wagon was ever found beyond that point. The Pikes had vanished completely. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued, but with each passing day, the evidence became stranger. The bones from the underground chamber were catalogued and sent to Charleston for examination, but according to the doctor's reports, some didn't match normal human anatomy. Certain bones were fused in unnatural ways, while others bore markings consistent with ritual carving. The symbols etched into them matched those carved into the chamber walls. Whitfield stayed in Marlinton for several more months, helping organize reports and testimonies, but no trace of the family, or Margaret, was ever discovered. Eventually, the case was filed as unresolved. The Pike estate was sealed, its land declared off limits by county order. Within a year, the main house mysteriously burned to the ground, leaving only the stone foundation and the old clearing deep in the woods. Locals say that even decades later, when the wind howls through those mountains, it carries faint echoes, like chanting from somewhere beneath the earth. And every now and then, travelers still go missing in that part of West Virginia, authored by the founder of the Pike lineage in America, a man named Hinrich Pike. In those yellowed, time-worn pages, Hinrich recounted his journey from a mountainous region of Germany to the American colonies, and eventually into the remote Appalachian wilderness. He wrote of the need to preserve traditions that had been outlawed and hunted in Europe. Ancient knowledge passed secretly through generations, dating back to an era before Christianity took root among his ancestors. Hinrich described how he had discovered this particular valley, recognizing in the contours of the land and the formation of rocks what he called signs of power. He spoke of lines of force and points of convergence, concepts Whitfield recognized faintly from his readings on old European occult practices. The newer journals, however, were even more disturbing. One, written in 1917 by Ezekiel Pike, spoke in detail of what he called necessary cycles. Ezekiel described that every 7 years since the estate's founding, the family had performed a ceremony known as the covenant renewal. The ritual, he claimed, ensured protection, prosperity, and good health for the Pike family. He avoided clear explanations of what it entailed, but ominous phrases like life, giving offerings, and balancing sacrifices sent a deep chill through Whitfield's blood. Then prosecutor Henry Blackwell uncovered something far worse, a meticulously maintained list spanning more than a century. It recorded names, dates, and short descriptions. Among them was William Cord, entered under March 1918, identified simply as unconnected traveler accepted by the land. Dozens of others were noted in the same careful handwriting. Not every disappearance from the region was listed, but many were. The record was horrifyingly precise, a ledger of lives taken. While the papers were examined, other investigators explored the estate grounds. They discovered an intricate network of underground tunnels linking various parts of the property. Some led to additional chambers filled with human remains. Others contained peculiar artifacts, carvings made of bone and wood, etched with the same cryptic symbols found in the main chamber. Small effigies shaped like distorted human forms filled several shelves, their proportions grotesquely wrong, their faces barely human. The doctor assigned to examine the remains began his preliminary analysis inside the chamber discovered the previous night. After several hours of work, he concluded that the bones belonged to at least 40 different individuals, possibly more. Many were fragmented or commingled, making precise identification impossible. Based on the deterioration of the remains and the age of personal items found nearby, he believed some dated back many decades, perhaps even to the late 1700s. Still, there was no sign of Margaret Cord or of any living member of the Pike family. Searchers tried to follow tracks leading away from the property, but the heavy rain had erased nearly all evidence. Only faint traces in the mud suggested a small group had fled on foot into the deeper forest. The trail vanished within a few hundred yards among the thick pines. That afternoon, as the investigation continued, an elderly man approached the property. He introduced himself as Joseph Whitmore elder brother of Jacob Whitmore, the farmer who had first reported suspicious activity. Joseph, now in his 70s, had lived his entire life in the region. He said he carried information he had long concealed out of fear, but could no longer remain silent. Joseph explained that as a young man, around 1870, he had worked briefly for the Pike family under Abraham Pike, Ezekiel's grandfather. Hired to assist with the harvest, he had stayed for 3 weeks, and during that time, witnessed things that haunted him ever since. He recalled seeing nighttime rituals deep in the forest, strange gatherings involving chants and symbols he couldn't understand. He saw the family handle objects that seemed unnatural and experienced things he had tried his whole life to dismiss as dreams. One evening, Abraham Pike had spoken to him over supper, perhaps emboldened by drink or loneliness. Abraham insisted that his family were not murderers as outsiders would believe. They did not kill for pleasure, greed, or cruelty. What they did, he said, was a duty, a grim necessity. There were powers older than humankind, forces of the earth that demanded respect and equilibrium. To ignore them would invite ruin. Their rituals were acts of maintenance, not evil. Abraham compared their practices to farming. Just as a farmer must slaughter livestock to live, or cut down crops to eat, so too did they perform sacrifices, not for themselves, but to feed the land itself. The earth, he said, required nourishment to sustain life, to keep the cycles of creation and decay in balance. Joseph's testimony cast the entire investigation in a new, darker light. The Pikes were not simple killers. They were zealots of an ancient, corrupted faith, convinced their crimes preserved cosmic balance. Prosecutors were divided on how to proceed. On one side, there was undeniable evidence of mass murder. On the other, they faced a vanished family and a belief system older than the nation itself. State authorities soon took over, deploying more investigators, archaeologists, and historians. The entire property was searched, every cabin field and tunnel meticulously documented. What emerged was a portrait of a lineage living by principles untouched by time, guided by an alien logic of faith and fear. The journals revealed that the Pikes did not choose victims at random. They sought people who were unbound, those without close family, travelers, or the forgotten. In their writings, such individuals were described as already detached from the web of ordinary life. To the Pikes, these were gifts the world had already released, offerings brought by fate itself. Most chilling of all was their precision. The family chronicled every detail: names, dates, weather, the phase of the moon, the alignment of the stars, and the results that followed: bountiful harvests, unbroken health, and storms that bypassed their land while destroying others. To them, these were proofs, signs that their covenant still held. As Whitfield read through the journals, horror gave way to realization. The Pike family had not seen themselves as killers or heretics. In their own minds, they had been keepers of balance, guardians of an ancient pact written not in words, but in blood, convinced they were performing an essential duty, maintaining a fragile balance that, if ignored, could unleash devastation far worse than any individual loss. It was a closed, self-justifying belief system. When fortune smiled upon them, it confirmed their righteousness. When misfortune struck, it proved only that they had not been devout enough in their practices. Meanwhile, the hunt for Margaret Cord and the Pike family pressed on. Expert trackers were summoned from distant regions, men who knew the Appalachian wilderness as intimately as their own homes. They soon found evidence that a group had moved swiftly through the forest during the storm, following hidden mountain paths known only to a few. The tracks suggested a party of 10 to 12 individuals, and occasionally, in the mud, there were signs of dragging, implying someone had been taken by force. The trail led them deeper into the wilderness, into terrain so rugged and remote that even seasoned hunters rarely ventured there. After 3 grueling days, the searchers discovered a temporary encampment. Traces of a fire, impressions in the earth, where people had sat or lain down, and something that made every man's heart quicken: a torn piece of blue fabric, perfectly matching the dress Margaret had worn when she vanished. The find rekindled hope that she might still be alive, though it also intensified the urgency, for every hour lost reduced her chances of survival. Reinforcements arrived, swelling the party to more than 30 men, including volunteers from neighboring towns driven by fear and outrage. Their efforts finally led them to a deep, narrow valley ringed by steep cliffs. There they made a chilling discovery: Another stone circle, larger and older than the ones near the Pike estate. The moss-covered stones were half buried in the ground, weathered by centuries. In its center were fresh ashes and remnants of a ritual, charred herbs, small animal bones arranged in deliberate patterns, and grooves in the soil suggesting that something heavy had been dragged. But there was no trace of the Pikes or Margaret Cord. It was as though they had dissolved into the wilderness. The men combed the valley for caves or hidden passages, finding only shallow crevices in the rock, none large enough to conceal a group. One of the trackers, Samuel Swimmer, a Cherokee man who knew those mountains better than anyone, grew uneasy upon seeing the stone circle. He said his grandfather had told stories of such places, ancient sites considered both sacred and perilous, where the barrier between worlds grew thin and where, under the right conditions, other things could pass through. Old tales, half forgotten, yet Samuel swore there was truth in them. Back in Marlinton, tension grew as the story exploded across the state. Newspapers printed lurid headlines about hidden cults in the mountains, ritual murders, and a missing family at the heart of an ancient conspiracy. Reporters flooded the small town, eager for any scrap of information. What had begun as a local investigation had become a nationwide sensation. Prosecutor Henry Blackwell found himself under immense pressure. He had more than enough evidence of crimes, the human remains, the journals, the testimonies. Yet he had no living suspects. The Pike family had vanished as completely as their victims. Arrest warrants were issued for every known adult member, but they were meaningless without anyone to serve them upon. Whitfield, meanwhile, began forming a theory that bordered on madness. What if the Pikes had truly believed in their rituals? And what if, somehow, their final ceremony had not been meant to summon protection or fortune, but escape? The recovered writings mentioned passages, thresholds, and crossings between layers of existence. He had dismissed these as metaphors for spiritual transformation, but now he wondered, what if they were not symbolic at all? He kept these thoughts private, fearing ridicule. Yet the question consumed him, how could a group of a dozen people, including the elderly and possibly a captive, simply vanish in a valley being combed by trained men? Why was there no trace beyond the stone circle? Weeks passed, then months. Autumn turned to winter, and the mountains became impassable. Snow blanketed the trails, freezing rivers and burying any clues that might have remained. The search was reluctantly suspended until spring. Margaret Cord was declared missing under suspicious circumstances. The Pike family was officially wanted for multiple murders, but none were ever found. When spring returned in 1919, search teams resumed their efforts, scouring the mountains anew. Yet the thaw revealed nothing. The valley with the stone circle was excavated, mapped, and examined by experts, but no new answers emerged. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The Pike estate, left deserted, quickly became a source of fascination and dread. Locals whispered of eerie sensations near the property, of sudden confusion, voices murmuring from nowhere, and strange lights flickering in the trees at night. Authorities dismissed such tales as superstition, but the fear persisted. Within months, no one dared to approach the land after dark. Whitfield remained in Marlinton nearly a year after the disappearances, unable to let go. Haunted by guilt over Margaret's fate, he continued his own quiet investigation, revisiting sites, re-interviewing witnesses, and poring over the recovered writings. His notebooks filled with sketches, theories, and desperate attempts to piece together a truth that refused to take shape. One conclusion disturbed him more than any other: the silence of the community. Not an active conspiracy, perhaps, but a passive complicity. Many in the area had long suspected that something was wrong at the Pike property. Strange sounds, missing travelers, unexplained lights in the woods. Yet none had acted. They had looked away, convincing themselves that whatever happened up there in the hills was none of their concern. And perhaps, Whitfield thought bitterly, that silence had been exactly what the Pikes depended on. There were several reasons for this. Chief among them, fear. The Pike family carried a menacing reputation, and few dared to confront them directly. But there was also a peculiar sense of reluctant respect. The Pikes tended to leave people alone if they were not provoked, and on occasion, their obscure healing practices seemed to bring benefits to the surrounding communities. Another complication lay in the nation's foundational principle of religious freedom. Where exactly was the boundary between respecting spiritual expression and intervening when that expression crossed into the realm of crime? The Pikes had masterfully exploited that ambiguity for generations, disguising deliberate acts of murder beneath the protection of religious tradition. Whitfield's research into old archives uncovered that the Pike family was not an isolated case. Scattered across the Appalachian Mountains were records of other families, immigrants from various parts of Europe, who practiced rituals rooted in pre-Christian customs. Over time, most had assimilated into mainstream society, abandoning their ancient ways, while others had been forcibly dispersed when their activities drew unwanted attention. Yet the Pikes were unique. They had managed to preserve their beliefs and ceremonies intact for over a century and a half in America. For Prosecutor Blackwell, the legal situation was complex. Although the evidence clearly showed that multiple crimes had been committed, it was impossible to prosecute those who had vanished. He focused instead on compiling an exhaustive record, every document, artifact, and testimony carefully catalogued, so that justice could be pursued if any of the Pikes were ever located. Human remains recovered from the property were analyzed by specialists from Eastern universities. Through personal items and cross-referenced missing persons reports, several victims were identified, including William Cord, confirmed by the pocket watch engraved with his initials. 3 more victims were linked to disappearances spanning the previous 3 decades, though many others remained nameless, unidentified casualties of a ritualistic pattern of violence stretching far beyond living memory. In the summer of 1919, a hunter named Daniel Cross stumbled upon a remarkable discovery deep in the wilderness, about 20 miles past the official search perimeter. Hidden in a rocky alcove, he found a small camp that appeared to have been recently occupied. There were faint traces of a fire, leftover food scraps, and markings that indicated several people had slept there. The finding reignited the investigation, prompting a new expedition into the remote terrain. After days of grueling travel through dense forest and treacherous valleys, the team reached the cave, but it was deserted. Whoever had stayed there was long gone. Whitfield joined the group and noticed a detail others had overlooked. Carved into the cave wall were symbols, cruder and simpler than the ones found at the Pike estate, yet clearly of the same origin. Beneath them, scrawled in shaky English letters, were the words, "They follow a path we cannot. The sacrifice is complete. The passage is closed." No one could determine its meaning. Perhaps a member of the Pike family had written it, marking the end of their journey. Or perhaps it was Margaret Cord's final act, carved in desperation if she had survived that long. The handwriting was too rough and hastily etched to identify with certainty. That would prove to be the last trace of the Pikes or Margaret Cord. Despite renewed efforts, no additional evidence surfaced. It was as if the family had dissolved into the mountains themselves, becoming one with the folklore of Appalachia. By autumn of 1919, Whitfield departed West Virginia. He had gathered every fact, interviewed every witness, and followed every lead, yet the case remained unresolved. With no suspects to prosecute and no new discoveries, the investigation was quietly closed, consigned to history as another unsolved horror. Before leaving, Whitfield visited the Pike estate one final time. The October air was thick with fog, the hills ghostly under a pale sky. He walked through the abandoned property, the silent buildings, the sealed chamber beneath the earth, and tried to imagine what life had been like for those born into that lineage. The terror of their story, he realized, was not only in their deeds but in the unwavering conviction behind them. The Pikes had not acted out of greed or cruelty, but out of a genuine, dreadful belief that they were serving a sacred duty. That certainty, the absence of doubt, was what made their darkness most chilling. As dusk fell, Whitfield wrote his final notes, reflecting on the peril of blind faith. He warned of traditions kept alive in isolation, untested by the outside world, and of how belief can twist morality until the unthinkable becomes sanctified. He ended by naming the victims, those identified and those lost to time, sacrificed to a worldview that saw them not as human beings, but as instruments of cosmic purpose. In the years that followed, the Pike land was seized by Greenbrier County and left abandoned. No one would buy it, no matter how cheap it became. Its name turned from scandal to symbol of how easily belief can justify the monstrous when veiled in ritual. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, scattered reports surfaced, distant silhouettes spotted in the mountains, figures moving at dusk, always too far to recognize. Some swore the Pikes still roamed those woods, following paths no living soul could ever walk again. People often claimed to glimpse strange shapes vanishing into the wilderness before they could be approached. In 1923, a shepherd hiking along remote trails said he heard chanting in an unfamiliar tongue echoing through a valley. 5 years later, hunters reported discovering a stone circle absent from any known maps, showing signs of recent use. Yet none of these accounts were officially confirmed, and with time, they slipped into legend. Campfire tales told more for thrill than truth. As the Great Depression brought crushing hardship to Appalachia, the Pike family faded into obscurity. World War II shifted attention to global conflicts, and the Pike mystery was gradually reduced to local folklore, a half-remembered cautionary tale. Generations grew up hearing fragmented retellings, distorted, exaggerated, interwoven with other regional myths, until fact and fiction were indistinguishable. Jonathan Whitfield never published his findings in full. He kept his notebooks, photographs, and exhaustive analyses of the Pike documents, but guarded them privately. When he occasionally discussed the case among colleagues, he did so reluctantly, visibly weighed down by its memory. Whitfield died in 1946, and his collection was later donated to the West Virginia Historical Archives, where it sat largely untouched for decades. Renewed interest came in the 1970s, when scholars studying Appalachian folklore and unresolved crimes rediscovered the Pike material. Researchers began piecing together details that early investigators had overlooked, uncovering records of similar ritual practices scattered throughout the mountains. The Pikes, it appeared, were not an anomaly but rather an extreme, unusually well-documented instance of an older belief system that had endured in seclusion. Debate arose among academics. Some viewed the Pike saga as a case of serial murder masked by ideology. Others interpreted it as a striking example of cultural isolation, a group clinging so tightly to ancestral customs that those traditions grew warped, detached from the moral frameworks of the outside world. Still others focused on the question of complicity, how entire communities can turn away from horror when it arrives cloaked in ritual and faith. By the early 1980s, the decaying Pike estate was finally demolished. Its tunnels were filled with concrete, the ruins leveled and reforested in an effort to erase the past. But stories have a way of enduring. The tale of the Pikes never truly vanished. Margaret Cord's fate remains one of its deepest mysteries. No one knows whether she perished the night she disappeared, was held captive, or met some other end. The words carved into the cave wall remain ambiguous, their meaning forever uncertain. No verified sightings of any Pike family member have ever surfaced. Technically, they are still listed as fugitives, though it is almost certain they died long ago, either in the wilderness or in some distant, forgotten refuge. Beyond the historical record lies a haunting question: what are the limits of belief? The Pike family lived within a worldview where their acts were not seen as crimes but as holy rites, murders reimagined as offerings, brutality reframed as balance. To them, they were guardians of ancient order, servants of forces larger than themselves. Understanding this doesn't soften the horror of their deeds or lessen the grief of their victims, but it illuminates how such atrocities can occur, how conviction once sealed off from scrutiny can turn morality inside out. It also underscores why vigilance is vital, why any belief system that isolates itself from outside perspective becomes dangerous. The Appalachian Mountains are vast and secretive, filled with hidden valleys, uncharted trails, and caves that have never seen light. Perhaps remnants of the Pike's world still linger somewhere, or perhaps other. Similar stories remain undiscovered. The mountains are old, and their silence is deep. The Pike case endures as one of the strangest and most unsettling episodes in American criminal history, not because of its violence alone, but because of what it reveals about faith, tradition, and the human capacity to rationalize evil. It is a warning about how the past can entrap the present, how inherited customs can twist into cages, and how absolute certainty can be the most perilous belief of all. Today, the land where the Pike estate once stood is unremarkable forest. Trees rise where walls once stood, earth hides the sealed tunnels. There are no signs, no markers, nothing to tell passers-by of the darkness buried beneath their feet. It's as though the land itself wishes to forget. Yet the memory endures in archives and in Whitfield's faded notebooks. And perhaps it should endure, not to glorify the terror, but to remind us that evil often wears the face of conviction, that isolation distorts truth, and that blind tradition can become perilous. The mountains remain quiet, their valleys heavy with secrets. And we are left with the same unsettling questions, echoes of the Pike's vanished chants fading into the mist of the Appalachian hills.